talking Mars in Aries 2020-2021. This is one of the most important transits of the year. It's a very rare transit because Mars will be retrograde during this time. And before I begin, I want to just lay out an ISAR ethics rule. This is from their ethical standards and guidelines, and it's Rule A9, responsibility to the public. I think it's important here to make these disclaimers before I dive into some mundane astrology that can feel scary. But there's these three disclaimers that this rule brings. 1, astrology is not an exact science. 2, astrological variables can manifest in different events of similar meaning. And that just means that sometimes the past doesn't predict the future, right? It's just a tone or an energy that can kind of be reenacted, but it doesn't mean the same thing will happen. And then 3, astrology cannot predict with absolute certainty the outcome of future astronomical events. I'm not sure about this astronomical events part of this rule. I don't think astrologers are trying to predict astronomy. We're getting energies, we're mapping the flow of symbols, and it's not this exact specificity with how we're able to predict. I'm actually a pray for peace guy, and I see the world kind of growing into something wondrous and beautiful and lovely, and that's what I try to project with my thoughts. This Mars and Aries transit is as long a time as Mars will ever spend in a sign, because the retrograde station of Mars happens in the second to last degree. And so Mars enters Aries, moves through 29 degrees, okay, retrogrades and comes back and will station in the 16th degree, and then moves through the whole half of the sign a second time before exiting in January 2021 and entering Taurus. And so Mars will be here for over 6 months. Mars is also domiciled in Aries, so this allows Mars to have full access to its resources at home, right? Think about a planet or a person being in the home, things they've set up, they know where everything is in the home. So it's pure martial energy. Mars will be able to do the things that Mars does. Mars is cutting, separation, fire, passion, can be argument, it can be kind of conflict. So these martial energies, I think, will just add fire and tension to the year as it unfolds. The other thing about Mars' time in Aries during this transit is that Mars will be overcome by Jupiter and Saturn from Capricorn, and will make 3 squares with both Jupiter and Saturn from Capricorn. The square is a dynamic, tense, active aspect that really can produce change. And so Mars has 6 total squares with the 2 great outer planets of the traditional system, right? Jupiter and Saturn. Okay, if you're into dwarf planets, and if you like to look at dwarf planets, 4 of the 5 official dwarf planets will actually be making an angular relationship to Mars and Saturn and Jupiter as well. Pluto will be in Capricorn, Haumea and Makemake in Libra, Eris and Aries. 7 times in the Common Era has Mars stationed retrograde in Aries while Saturn was in Capricorn overcoming Mars. Only 7 times. And the last 2 were in 1783 and 1587. 3 September 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed between Britain and America, ending the Revolutionary War officially. And during this transit, Mars was fully in Aries. It stationed retrograde in Aries, and it stationed direct in Aries. The whole transit, the whole retrograde was in Aries, and Saturn overcame from Capricorn during both of those stations. And during this year, actually, there was a triple pass square between Saturn and Mars as well, all in Aries and Capricorn. And the feature here of Saturn restricting Mars, right? Saturn is earlier in zodiacal order, which means Saturn would win, so-called, if we want to use that interpretive principle. So this restriction of the martial signification. Saturn is also strong in its own domicile in Capricorn, can do Saturnian things well. So Saturn is boundaries, endings, maturity. And so that wins out here over the tendency for maybe Mars to want to act out. And we get this peaceful end to a long war and a period of instability. Just a note here that in 2020-2021, Mars and Saturn do square off 3 times, but the first 2 only have Mars in Aries, Saturn in Capricorn. That 3rd square is after Saturn ingresses into Aquarius and Mars into Taurus. We have both of Mars's stations overcome by Saturn and Capricorn, like in 1783, like the time before that in 1578, which that transit is also very interesting because Mars was fully retrograde in Aries again, Saturn overcame for both of the stations, and there was a triple pass square, Aries and Capricorn, for all three between Saturn and Mars. This is the chart. We don't have an exact date for this event, but it's in July of 1578 at some point. Mars had entered Aries before July, so it's right in the early degrees of Aries before the later retrograde station. But it's the first Thanksgiving. It's one option for the first Thanksgiving. English colonizers landed in Canada, had some difficulties with the ice, and then they land in Canada and celebrate this moment of Thanksgiving. But there's something essential to the history of North America here. These transits, these Mars retrograde in Aries overcome by Saturn and Capricorn transits, seem to time great transitions on the North American continent. 1578, first Thanksgiving, English colonizers here, colonizing the land. 1783, the establishment of the American government, so the institution that has been here for the last 200 some odd years. And then 2020. I want to say that we've already seen in 2020 some symbolic changing of the guards. Archmason Albert Pike had a statue in DC. He's a very influential figure in Scottish Rite Freemasonry. He wrote this very important book to Masons, Morals and Dogma, that sort of summarized their esoteric worldview. And his statue was torn down. I look at the statue when you see it, and these shots of it being spray painted. I mean, there's terror in Albert Pike's eyes, is how I see it. But it's this symbol that the Masonic bedrock of the American oligarchy is now being torn away. Next, I want to talk about the two times last that Mars has stationed retrograde in Aries. And we have 1988 and 1941. 1988 is interesting because the U.S. forces shot down an Iranian passenger jet. So there was this martial tension for a moment there, right? But also the Soviets were busy pulling out troops from Afghanistan. And so the Soviets, again, a war winding down. Saturn in this year was overcoming Mars, first from Sag and then actually from Capricorn after Mars moved into Aries. So you do have this Saturnian kind of winning an aspect, overcoming Mars. And I think we see this restriction of war. And then the time before that is 1941, and this time there was a full retrograde cycle in Aries. And after Mars moved direct, and this is the last time there was a full retrograde cycle of Mars in Aries, so Mars starts moving direct, working its way through the shadow, and Pearl Harbor happens. And so this is the kind of volatile time. Once Mars gets that energy going forward again, I think martial things, this might be when more martial things can kind of unfold here. But notice this time Saturn is averse to Mars. So Saturn isn't overcoming Mars and restricting those martial features like it will be in 2020. The U.S. Sibley chart has the Sun in Cancer. And so Mars in Aries, Saturn in Aquarius are both angular to the U.S. Sibley Sun. It's just worth noting that because I think, like I said earlier, these watershed moments for the North American experience, anytime you have angular malefics to that sect light, it can actually be kind of turning points and great moments of change and shift. 1531 is a really interesting year because Mars retrograde station was at 29 degrees, 0 degree minutes, Aries. So almost in that second to last degree, like in 2020. In 2020, the degree is 28 degrees, 8 degree minutes. And so it's not the same degree, but it's darn close. And the degree of the direct stations are actually only 1 degree minute apart in 1531 and in 2020. And this year, Juan Diego received a vision of the Virgin Mary, known as Our Lady of Guadalupe, near what is now Mexico City, after Mars had turned direct. So Mars started moving forward, and you get this visionary divine contact, propagation of colonial symbols, right? The Catholic Church moving into the New World and kind of pushing its symbol set on the indigenous populations. So there's also a theme of colonization here coming through the 1531 transit. So in 2020, when we have Venus during the whole time of the Mars-Saturn square, Venus will make a sign-based aspect to either Mars or Saturn. So Venus sees, kind of oversees this whole tense moment we're in. And so there might be an opportunity for some divine feminine spirituality. The next degree hit, this one hit me like a sack of bricks. I posted this on Twitter yesterday. The last time Mars stationed retrograde in the 29th degree of Aries was in 64 CE, so about 2,000 years ago. And I didn't look and research this before I sent the tweet out because I've kind of focused my practice more on the last 200 years because we have better records. But as soon as I tweeted this, Kel Karpinski responded, "Is that when Rome burned?" And it hit me like a ton of bricks, like I said, and it actually is when Rome burned. And the Roman Empire is a time when we do have fairly good records. And so July 64 CE, Mars just had entered Aries. The first part of that transit, Rome burns. And it's this great symbolic destruction of Rome and the Roman Empire at that time, and a kind of apocalyptic side to the Roman experience during that first century of the Common Era. And it's symbolically really heavy for me because the symbols of Rome have percolated all the way into the 20th century. Some have even said that America is the new Rome, right? The dollar bill has an eagle with that wreath around the eagle, which was an important symbol in Rome. The importance of Mars in 2020, aside from the Aries retrograde transit, which is extremely important like we've just seen, but Mars has another hidden side to how important it is during this year, and I'm calling it the Mars Code of 2020. And just at the outset, the Aries ingress is extremely important. It's actually the chart for the next 20 years. It's a root chart for the next 20 years because it is the Aries ingress prior to the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. In that root chart, Mars is bona fide by Jupiter and by Venus. And I'm not going to go into the full extent of that technique, but just know Mars is encased between the benefic energy, and it gives Mars a protection, and it protects the powers of Mars. And I think it will ultimately bonify Mars's tendency toward war. Maybe this will take the edge off, and whatever conflicts end up happening will be in this kind of a greater good or in the service of the greater good. The other thing is that Mars conjoined Jupiter in that Aries ingress and perfected the conjunction in the degree that Saturn and Pluto conjoined in January 2020, the 22nd degree of Capricorn, or the 23rd degree of Capricorn, 22 Cap. 0 Aquarius, the first degree of Aquarius is where Saturn joined Mars on March 31st, 2020, and it's the same degree that Saturn will join Jupiter on the winter solstice of 2020. It's the Mars code, right? Mars has hit these really important degrees with Saturn's conjunctions with Jupiter and Pluto. And because it's bona fide in the Aries ingress and hitting these degrees, Mars is kind of under the surface and in the background and guiding this threshold transition into 2020. And this might be why it's felt so martial, so much tension, so much change, a lot of violence, a lot of unrest, a lot of destruction. It's for the service of good is my read, that we have this kind of benefic divinity, this divine Shakti energy, and this bona fide Mars, so that this threshold will transition us into something more beneficial to everybody, for all beings. Cardomancy pull, uncanny, because I use the random number generator. This is the third time the Discord card has come up in these readings, the 5 of Spades. It is the decan where the 0 Aquarius conjunctions take place, and Venus and Aquarius being about boundaries and relationships. That's kind of what I've seen coming up again for people I've been engaged with recently, that where does do we take on the emotional insides of another person? Is that wise? I think we actually can't do it, right? I can't control someone else's thoughts. I can't modulate their emotions. It's just impossible. But there is a problem when I believe I can, and I start emotionally responding as if I could control someone else's insides. And that kind of that enmeshment can be so detrimental to the mutual rise of both individuals in a relationship. I encourage you just to explore autonomy when it comes to relationship and how that can actually benefit and fuel a relationship. All right, and as always, you can book a donation-based reading with me. I love reading for people. sjanderson144.com. This audio is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and other players, so you can find it there. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at sjanderson144.